You're listening to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, created to help you succeed in your educational journey. Learn more at baremetalcyber.com, where additional prepcasts, books, and training materials await. Let's get started. Online privacy rests on a foundation of technologies and practices that enable tracking, profiling, and personalization, but also create risks that must be managed with transparency and restraint. Tracking allows websites and apps to recognize returning users, measure engagement, and monetize content through advertising, while profiling organizes behavior into categories that can guide marketing, credit, or employment decisions. These activities intersect directly with consumer expectations. Users want seamless experiences but also demand choice and control over how their data is collected and used. For exam candidates, the key concept is duality. Online tracking can deliver convenience and business value, but it also raises concerns about fairness, transparency, and misuse. Scenarios may test whether tracking without notice aligns with privacy principles, with the correct recognition being no. Recognizing this emphasizes that online privacy requires balancing utility with trust by aligning practices to both legal requirements and consumer expectations. First-party and third-party cookies remain the core mechanisms for session state and tracking across the web. First-party cookies, set by the domain a user directly visits, often store login information or shopping cart items to enable functionality. Third-party cookies, by contrast, are placed by outside domains, typically advertising networks, to track users across multiple sites and build behavioral profiles. While first-party cookies are generally seen as necessary for usability, third-party cookies have become controversial due to their opacity and potential for cross-context profiling. For exam purposes, the key concept is distinction. Scenarios may test whether both types of cookies are equally regulated, with the correct recognition being no third-party cookies usually face stricter scrutiny. Recognizing this ensures candidates understand how cookie governance reflects broader debates about necessity, proportionality, and consumer choice in online privacy. Software development kits, or SDKs, in mobile applications extend tracking capabilities beyond the browser. SDKs are pre-built code modules that developers embed to provide features such as analytics, advertising, or social sharing. While convenient, SDKs often collect extensive user data, including identifiers, app usage, or even location, sometimes without the developer fully understanding the scope of collection. This creates accountability risks, as the app publisher remains responsible for disclosing and managing SDK-based tracking. For exam candidates, the key lesson is shared responsibility. Embedding an SDK does not shift liability. Scenarios may test whether app publishers can disclaim responsibility for third-party SDKs, with the correct recognition being no. Recognizing this highlights that organizations must evaluate SDKs carefully, include them in privacy notices, and enforce contractual safeguards to maintain consumer trust and legal compliance. Pixel tags and web beacons function as invisible elements embedded in websites or emails that trigger requests when content is loaded. These tiny graphics or code snippets often send information back to servers, enabling analytics providers or advertisers to track engagement. For example, marketers use pixel tags in emails to measure open rates, while advertisers use them on web pages to track conversions. Because they are invisible, consumers often have no awareness they are being tracked, raising concerns about transparency. For exam candidates, the key concept is hidden collection. Scenarios may test whether disclosures must cover pixel tracking, with the correct recognition being yes. Recognizing this ensures candidates appreciate that accountability requires organizations to disclose all forms of tracking, visible or not, and provide users with meaningful choices about whether and how these tools are employed. Device fingerprinting represents a more sophisticated tracking method that relies on configuration and behavioral signals rather than stored identifiers. Fingerprints combine attributes such as browser type, operating system, installed fonts, screen resolution, and even typing patterns to create a unique profile that can recognize a device across sessions. Because users cannot easily clear or block fingerprints as they can with cookies, regulators often treat fingerprinting as highly invasive. For exam candidates, the key concept is persistence. Scenarios may test whether fingerprinting avoids privacy scrutiny because it lacks identifiers. With the correct recognition being no, it is still regulated. Recognizing this highlights that online privacy accountability extends beyond cookies, requiring organizations to disclose and justify fingerprinting practices and to ensure they align with consent and minimization principles. Cross-context behavioral advertising builds detailed profiles by linking user behavior across multiple sites, apps, or services. Advertisers can track shopping habits, browsing history, and social interactions to create granular audience segments for targeted marketing. While effective for revenue generation, these practices raise significant concerns about fairness, manipulation, and erosion of anonymity. For exam purposes, the key terms are linkage and context. Scenarios may test whether behavioral advertising requires opt-out mechanisms, with the correct recognition being yes under many state laws. Recognizing this illustrates that online profiling must respect consumer preferences, provide transparency, and limit scope to avoid overreach, ensuring advertising efficiency does not undermine trust or cross ethical boundaries. Sensitive data categories demand heightened restrictions when collected online. These categories include health status, financial information, children's data, precise geolocation, and biometric identifiers. Collecting and using such data for profiling or advertising amplifies risks, requiring explicit consent or legal justification. Regulators impose stricter duties, such as prohibitions on discriminatory use or mandatory opt-ins. For exam candidates, the key lesson is elevated obligation. Scenarios may test whether sensitive categories can be treated like general browsing data, with the correct recognition being no. Recognizing this highlights that online privacy accountability requires organizations to identify sensitive categories early, apply stricter safeguards, and ensure collection and use are limited, lawful, and defensible under heightened regulatory scrutiny. Global Privacy Control, or GPC, represents a standardized browser signal that communicates user opt-out preferences to websites automatically. Unlike earlier initiatives, GPC has gained traction through state privacy laws, which explicitly require organizations to honor it as a valid opt-out mechanism for sale or sharing of data. This shifts responsibility from users clicking through banners to browsers transmitting persistent signals. For exam candidates, the key concept is enforceable preference. Scenarios may test whether organizations must honor GPC signals, with the correct recognition being yes in covered jurisdictions. Recognizing this underscores that accountability requires not only offering choice but also respecting automated signals, reducing friction for users, and embedding preferences into online ecosystems transparently and consistently. Do Not Track, or DNT, provides an instructive history in signal standardization efforts. Launched over a decade ago, DNT was intended to allow browsers to send opt-out requests, but adoption faltered because industry participation was voluntary and inconsistent. Few websites honored DNT, and regulators did not enforce it, leading to its decline. For exam purposes, the key concept is lesson learned. Signals require enforceability to succeed. Scenarios may test whether DNT remains binding, with the correct recognition being no. Recognizing this highlights why GPC has gained momentum. It is tied to statutory obligations, unlike DNT's voluntary framework. This contrast illustrates how accountability models evolve. Strong signals succeed only when backed by enforceable legal duties. Consent banners and preference centers serve as the most visible interfaces for consumer choice in online privacy. Banners present immediate options, often when cookies or tracking begin, while preference centers allow users to revisit and adjust their settings. To meet accountability standards, these tools must provide clarity, granularity, and ease of use. For exam candidates, the key concept is usability. Scenarios may test whether pre-ticked boxes meet consent standards, with the correct recognition being no. Recognizing this emphasizes that lawful consent requires active, informed choices, supported by clear interfaces and transparent explanations. Properly designed, consent tools reinforce trust, while also ensuring organizations can document preferences to demonstrate compliance. Children's online privacy requires additional safeguards due to heightened vulnerability. Under COPPA and similar statutes, organizations must obtain verifiable parental consent before collecting personal data from children under 13. Online contexts complicate this because age verification can be challenging, and consent mechanisms must balance protection with accessibility. For exam purposes, the key concept is verifiable consent. Scenarios may test whether implied consent from continued use suffices, with the correct recognition being no. Recognizing this highlights that accountability requires organizations to implement mechanisms that reasonably confirm parental involvement, document consent records, and ensure that children's data is collected and used lawfully and ethically. Location data and geofencing add unique privacy concerns because they reveal real-world behaviors and movement patterns. Laws increasingly limit how precise geolocation can be used, especially for sensitive contexts like visits to health clinics, places of worship, or political events. Geofencing restrictions prevent targeted advertising around these areas, reducing risks of exploitation. For exam candidates, the key concept is sensitivity of place. Scenarios may test whether location data is always permissible for advertising, with the correct recognition being no restrictions apply. Recognizing this underscores that accountability demands stronger safeguards for location-based data, ensuring it is used proportionately, transparently, and without discriminatory or exploitative effects. Data minimization and purpose limitation directly constrain the scope of online tracking. Minimization requires collecting only the identifiers or behavioral signals necessary for declared purposes, while purpose limitation prevents reuse of data for unrelated objectives. These principles ensure that online profiling does not become excessive or manipulative. For exam purposes, the key concept is constraint. Scenarios may test whether broad, undefined purposes are compliant, with the correct recognition being no. Recognizing this highlights that accountability requires organizations to set clear limits, enforce them across systems, and document compliance, ensuring that online tracking respects proportionality and consumer trust rather than expanding unchecked. Pseudonymization and de-identification are often used to mitigate risks in online datasets, but accountability requires recognizing re-identification risks. Even when identifiers are removed, combinations of data points, such as browsing history, IP addresses, or device characteristics, can re-identify individuals when cross-referenced with other sources. For exam candidates, the key lesson is skepticism. Scenarios may test whether de-identified data is always exempt from privacy laws, with the correct recognition being no if re-identification remains possible. Recognizing this underscores that accountability requires rigorous testing of anonymization claims, cautious interpretation of pseudonymization, and transparent disclosure of risks to regulators and consumers. Data broker ecosystems add another layer of complexity because downstream uses of consumer data are often opaque. Brokers aggregate information from multiple sources, combine it into profiles, and sell it to advertisers, insurers, or employers. This creates transparency challenges. Individuals rarely know who holds their data or how it is being used. For exam candidates, the key concept is opacity. Scenarios may test whether primary organizations remain accountable for broker transfers, with the correct recognition being yes. Recognizing this highlights that accountability requires organizations to track broker relationships, disclose them in notices, and implement contracts that extend obligations downstream, reinforcing transparency in otherwise hidden ecosystems. Platform privacy settings act as expectation setters for consumers. Defaults such as public profiles or on-tracking often create perceptions of misuse, while privacy-protective defaults build trust. Settings must be intuitive, transparent, and consistent with consumer expectations to align with accountability principles. For exam purposes, the key concept is defaults. Scenarios may test whether burying privacy options in complex menus demonstrates compliance, with the correct recognition being no. Recognizing this illustrates that accountability requires organizations to design platforms that respect consumer expectations, providing privacy by default, and ensuring that user control is both real and usable, aligning with regulatory expectations for fair design. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other prepcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. Profiling in the online context refers to the automated processing of personal data to evaluate or predict characteristics, preferences, or behaviors of individuals. This can range from basic segmentation, such as grouping users into age or interest categories, to higher-risk applications like credit scoring, employment screening, or insurance pricing. Accountability requires recognizing that not all profiling carries equal risks. Regulators often distinguish between low-tier uses, such as personalization of content, and consequential decisions that significantly affect individuals' rights or opportunities. For exam candidates, the key concept is tiered risk. The greater the potential for harm, the stronger the safeguards and disclosures required. Scenarios may test whether all profiling requires explicit consent, with the correct recognition being no. It depends on context, sensitivity, and impact. Recognizing these distinctions ensures candidates can explain how accountability frameworks align profiling practices with proportional safeguards, consumer expectations, and regulatory oversight. Audience matching involves linking user profiles across platforms through hashed identifiers, creating continuity for advertising or analytics without exposing raw personal data. For example, an email address may be hashed and matched to advertising platforms to deliver targeted campaigns. While hashing adds a layer of obfuscation, accountability requires recognizing that linkage can still re-identify individuals when combined with other datasets. This means organizations must disclose these practices transparently, classify them as sharing or sales where state laws apply, and honor consumer opt-outs. For exam purposes, the key concept is linkage through transformation. Scenarios may test whether hashing renders data anonymous, with the correct recognition being no. It remains personal information if it can be reversed or combined for identification. Recognizing this emphasizes that accountability extends to indirect identifiers, ensuring transparency and respect for individual choice, even when data is transformed for matching. Real-time bidding in programmatic advertising presents unique risks because user information is shared widely across ad exchanges in milliseconds. Data such as device identifiers, browsing history, and inferred interests are transmitted to multiple bidders, often without guarantees that all recipients limit their use. This creates risks of data leakage, uncontrolled downstream processing, and profiling beyond the user's knowledge. Accountability requires organizations to disclose real-time bidding practices, implement contractual safeguards, and ensure opt-out mechanisms are honored. For exam candidates, the key concept is uncontrolled distribution. Scenarios may test whether anonymization eliminates all risks in bidding, with the correct recognition being no profiles and identifiers can still be linked. Recognizing this highlights how accountability demands governance of complex advertising supply chains, balancing efficiency with transparency and consumer protection. Software supply chain risks emerge when websites or apps embed third-party scripts, trackers, or advertising components without fully understanding their data collection practices. These embedded tools can transmit user data to outside parties, sometimes contradicting stated privacy notices or exceeding intended scope. For exam purposes, the key lesson is hidden collection through supply chains. Scenarios may test whether publishers remain accountable for third-party scripts, with the correct recognition being yes, they control the environment. Recognizing this underscores that accountability extends into software dependencies. Organizations must vet scripts, monitor behavior, and use tag management systems to govern third-party components. ensuring transparency and alignment with user expectations even when outside code is deployed within their platforms. Preference signal governance ensures that user choices, such as global privacy control opt-outs, are respected across all tracking mechanisms. Tag management systems play a central role, enabling organizations to configure, enforce, and monitor whether trackers align with consumer preferences. For exam candidates, the key concept is enforceable preference. Scenarios may test whether honoring signals is optional, with the correct recognition being no, where statutes mandate recognition. Recognizing this highlights that accountability requires automated governance tools that prevent trackers from firing when consumers have opted out, ensuring compliance is operationalized technically, not just promised in policy. This demonstrates maturity in online privacy programs, embedding consumer choice into systems rather than relying on ad hoc manual enforcement. Privacy notices in the online context require greater specificity than generic corporate statements. Notices must explain exactly what tracking technologies are used, what data is collected, which third parties receive it, and for what purposes. They must also describe how consumers can opt out or withdraw consent. For exam purposes, the key concept is granular disclosure. Scenarios may test whether high-level notices like "we may share data with partners" suffice, with the correct recognition being no. Recognizing this emphasizes that accountability requires plain language, detailed notices that reflect actual practices, ensuring consumers understand the scope of tracking and profiling, and reinforcing transparency as a cornerstone of online privacy governance. Opt-out mechanisms for sale and sharing categorizations under state privacy laws provide users with statutory rights to prevent their data from being monetized or disclosed for targeted advertising. These mechanisms must be easy to use, accessible across platforms, and effective in practice. Organizations must also honor universal signals like GPC where applicable. For exam candidates, the key concept is enforceable choice. Scenarios may test whether simply providing a privacy notice satisfies opt-out obligations, with the correct recognition being no functional mechanisms are required. Recognizing this highlights that accountability requires empowering consumers to exercise rights easily and ensuring back-end systems enforce those preferences, demonstrating that legal obligations are embedded into real-world practices. Data subject rights extend into online contexts, requiring workflows for access, deletion, correction, and opt-out requests across web, app, and back-end systems. These processes must ensure that online identifiers, such as cookies or device IDs, can be linked to rights requests when feasible, enabling individuals to act on their data even in pseudonymous environments. For exam candidates, the key concept is integration. Scenarios may test whether rights apply only to directly identifiable information, with the correct recognition being no online identifiers are included. Recognizing this emphasizes that accountability requires comprehensive workflows for fulfilling rights requests across online ecosystems, reconciling pseudonymous identifiers with consumer control mechanisms. Dark patterns in online consent flows undermine accountability by manipulating or coercing users into accepting tracking. Examples include confusing button labels, pre-checked boxes, or overly complex withdrawal steps. Regulators increasingly prohibit such designs, requiring consent and withdrawal to be as simple and clear as possible. For exam candidates, the key concept is fairness in design. Scenarios may test whether manipulative defaults are compliant, with the correct recognition being no. Recognizing this underscores that accountability requires clarity, simplicity, and honesty in consent mechanisms, ensuring that consumer choices are genuine, not engineered through deceptive interfaces, and aligning design practices with ethical and legal standards. Security overlays for tracking data ensure that identifiers, logs, and profiles are protected against misuse or breaches. Encryption in transit and at rest, strict access controls, and monitoring systems all reduce risks of unauthorized use. These measures also demonstrate to regulators that privacy and security are integrated rather than siloed. For exam candidates, the key concept is safeguard integration. Scenarios may test whether tracking data is less sensitive and exempt from protection, with the correct recognition being no, it requires safeguards. Recognizing this highlights that accountability demands protecting tracking datasets with the same rigor as other personal information, acknowledging that even small identifiers can lead to significant harms if breached or misused. Retention limits must also be applied to tracking identifiers and derived profiles. Keeping logs indefinitely expands breach risks, increases storage costs, and amplifies litigation burdens. Accountability requires setting defined retention periods aligned with business need and legal obligations, with automated systems purging identifiers and profiles when no longer required. For exam candidates, the key lesson is horizon limitation. Scenarios may test whether perpetual retention demonstrates compliance, with the correct recognition being no. Recognizing this emphasizes that accountable programs enforce disposal of tracking data at defined intervals, reducing exposure and demonstrating disciplined lifecycle management consistent with minimization principles. Independent assessments and testing provide external validation that tracking practices align with published policies. These may include privacy audits, penetration tests of consent mechanisms, or third-party evaluations of whether opt-out signals are honored. Without such testing, organizations risk promising compliance but failing in practice. For exam candidates, the key concept is verification. Scenarios may test whether internal claims suffice as proof, with the correct recognition being no independent validation is required. Recognizing this underscores that accountability requires more than promises. It demands testing and assurance that online tracking and profiling are operating consistently with consumer disclosures and regulatory obligations. Metrics complete the accountability loop by providing visibility into online privacy performance. Metrics may include consent acceptance rates, percentage of signals honored, opt-out completion times, and incident trends. Dashboards translate these into governance views for executives, highlighting areas of improvement. For exam purposes, the key concept is measurement. Scenarios may test whether anecdotal observations demonstrate accountability, with the correct recognition being no quantitative metrics are expected. Recognizing this emphasizes that governance requires systematic measurement, ensuring that privacy performance is transparent, auditable, and continuously improved in response to consumer expectations and regulatory developments. Governance responsibilities for online privacy are shared across product, marketing, and engineering teams. Product managers ensure consent mechanisms and privacy settings align with legal requirements. Marketing teams must ensure campaigns respect opt-out preferences and avoid unauthorized sharing. Engineering teams configure systems to honor signals, enforce security overlays, and automate retention. For exam candidates, the key lesson is cross-functional ownership. Scenarios may test whether privacy is only the responsibility of legal teams, with the correct recognition being no multiple functions share accountability. Recognizing this highlights that accountability requires embedding privacy into product design, marketing execution, and technical architecture, ensuring coordinated enterprise-wide responsibility for online practices. By synthesizing tracking practices, profiling risks, and consumer expectations, online privacy programs align business objectives with trust and compliance. Transparent disclosures, clear consent mechanisms, minimized retention, and honored preferences transform tracking from a hidden practice into a managed, defensible governance activity. For exam candidates, the synthesis is clear. Accountability in online privacy means collecting only what is necessary, profiling responsibly, and giving consumers transparent, enforceable control over their information. Recognizing this highlights that sustainable online ecosystems require organizations to balance personalization and efficiency with fairness, transparency, and respect for individual autonomy. Thanks for tuning in to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, your trusted source for cybersecurity news and insights. Remember to subscribe at baremetalcyber.com so you never miss an update. And visit cyberauthor.me for best-selling cybersecurity books that equip you with expert knowledge. Until next time, stay secure and stay vigilant.